Welcome back to Philly Trial Lawyer Stories. I'm now about to embark on the next case, which involves my representation of Ralph Natale. Ralph was the head of the Bartenders Union, and in those days, I think it was Local 54. Later, it may have become 170. And he had a number of people in that union. It was in Atlantic City. And at that time, they had, obviously, casino gambling. The person who wrote the legislation for gambling in Atlantic City was a close friend of mine. And his name is Steve Persky. And Steve was a state senator down there. He was also the former chairman of the Casino Control Commission. He was governor's counsel under Florio. He was a Superior Court judge. And he has one of the most impressive resumes I could ever find anywhere among anybody. And I've already talked to Steve and told him some of the things I intend to say. And I believe that we're on the same page on things. When Steve wrote the legislation on casinos and gambling in Atlantic City, his goal was to create legislation that was a unique urban form of redevelopment. And what he wanted to do is be able to help the people in Atlantic City and the infrastructure build out and have better lives and take the money from the casinos in some extent and bring it back and put it back in the infrastructure on the city itself. One of the things that they did when they created the legislation is they were concerned about the infiltration of the mob into the casinos because they realized how that could have an impact on the operation of the casinos and basically the whole operation down there. I'm going to get into the hearing Ralph Natale had, actually two hearings in front of the United States Senate Subcommittee investigating the infiltration of the mob into the labor movement. My name is Glenn Zeitz, two N's, not one. I don't want to be cheated. I've been a trial lawyer for over 50 years. This podcast is about my cases, the stories of my clients, like Frank Sheeran, the Irishman who Robert De Niro played in the movie, Vera Koking, who was an elderly widow on Social Security in Atlantic City, where I sued the Trump Organization and Trump in two different cases, and other clients who I found in my life to be fascinating and interesting people. When Ralph became a client of mine, he was already doing 27 years. He had two cases that Bobby Simone, remember one of my mentors, if you will, silent mentors, a drug case down in Florida. And he had another case, a arson case, and both of them involved Charlie Allen. So he was doing 12 years on one and 15 on the other. So 27 years total. He was doing his time in Lewisburg, which is a maximum security prison. It's like a level 5. And they subpoenaed him to come before the Senate. The chair of the Senate, at that time, the subcommittee on, was William Roth from Delaware. And some of the members were Sam Nunn of Georgia, Warren Runman, I believe he was from Connecticut, Cohen from Maine, and then there was a few others on the committee. They also subpoenaed and they brought in Charlie Allen. And they brought in another federally protected witness called Joe Salerno. I have CDs from those hearings. And they have Scarfo at the top. And that's because little Nicky Starfo at that time, along with others, including Ralph, were the subjects of their investigation. And I knew that Ralph, was going to be required to testify because they gave him what's called a grant of immunity. And that meant that Ralph could not be prosecuted for anything that he would talk about unless he said something that was perjurious and he lied or perjured himself. But they wanted to put pressure on him in the following way. If you take the fifth, which you're entitled to do, and you don't testify and you've been given immunity, then they put you in contempt. And then instead of getting credit for your time when you're doing 27 years, you have to do the contempt until you purge yourself and you agree to cooperate and testify. So basically, they were trying to pressure him into testifying by giving him immunity for his testimony. This was my first opportunity to be in front of the United States Senate on a hearing, let alone a committee hearing where I knew they're going to be asking questions about Hoffa and various other things. Ralph wrote a book called Last Don Standing. And in that book, in chapter 21, he has a whole chapter, Mr. Natale goes to Washington. Now, this hearing was on June 22, 82. Now, understand how this was playing out. Before Ralph was called as a witness, they already had the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police. His last name was Dentino. He testified. Agent Jim Marr, who I told you about when we were doing the episode on Frank Sheeran, who was an expert in organized crime, he was there. And the only witness that I knew was coming in after Ralph was Nicky Scarfo himself with Bobby Simone. And you're going to see two screens. And behind the screens were two federally protected witnesses in the Federal Witness Protection Program, Charlie Allen and a guy named Joseph Salerno. And Salerno was there to testify to certain things that were specifically involved in Atlantic City and with Nicodemus Scarfo. And I remember when I got there, I was in this building called the Richard Russell Building in Washington, D.C. And I got there early, and I had a chance to look, and it was like a packed house. And I had an opportunity to talk to Ralph. And what I was concerned about at that time is something called a perjury trap. A perjury trap is when you're forced to testify, or you do testify, and they have things that they know they're going to ask you about, and somehow what you say is contrary to what they have. And one of my major concerns was that Ralph was doing time. He didn't have access to a lot of materials and documents. And I figured that there's going to be testimony of some sort at some point in time that they probably have on tape. And the only issue is going to be, are you going to be fair and give us a copy of a transcript of a tape or something like that? It's called discovery when you're in a criminal case, but this is a hearing. This is something different than an actual trial. So having said all that, I had an opportunity to speak with Ralph, prepare him, explain to him what this all meant, and he made the decision that he would testify. This is a transcript of the testimony that Ralph gave. In the very beginning, Senator Roth advises everybody that they're interested in whether organized crime or other corrupt influences are present in the Hotel Employees Union, either on a local or an international level. And he mentions that they had heard the name of Ralph Natale during the testimony of previous witnesses, and they've come across his name during the investigation. So after being told that, I tell them who I am, Glenn Zeitz, member of the bar, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and I confirm that the immunity was not requested or solicited by Mr. Natale, but was done ex parte. And I had a copy of the judge's order that was granting that immunity. And I explained to them a concern that I was going to have. If they go beyond the areas that I believe he should be questioned or could be, I'm going to have an objection to the scope. So I was basically laying the foundation for the fact that don't expect him to be able to answer every single question that you have because of his situation with regard to being in prison, not having access to certain materials, and basically not being in a position to answer some questions, even though he understood what he had to do. So in the very beginning, the first thing they do is they ask him, what role did Angelo Bruno play in the operation of Local 170? That was his union. His answer was none whatsoever. And then they say none whatsoever, answer none whatsoever. They asked him about Mr. Scarfo, answer none whatsoever. They wanted to know about his relationship when he met Angelo Bruno. He talked about how he met him when he was a teenager and was acquainted with him at that time of his death. Yes, he was. How would you describe him? He said, I was raised in the neighborhood. We knew Mr. Bruno. He was like a friend. That's about it. Did you ever do business with him? Answer, no business whatsoever. And then they asked him about whether or not he knew that Angelo Bruno controlled a substantial crime organization that had involvement in activities such as loan sharking, bribery, and arson. And he said, I don't know that as a fact. They asked him again, do you have any discussions with Mr. Bruno concerning organization of the hotel and restaurant workers in Atlantic City? His answer was none whatsoever. So then they asked him this question. At the time when he answered, I have to admit, I laughed. He says, how long have you known Charlie Allen? Answer, Charlie Allen? Well, what did Mr. Allen do for you? Answer, what did he do for me? Question, yeah. Answer, he put me in jail. He says, I don't mean to be a comedian, but that's what he did. And he said, did he work for you? And then he answered, when? He said, at any time. He said, no, he never worked for me. Did you ever pay Mr. Allen for any services at all? No, at no time, at no time. So that's how we begin. Senator Roth goes as follows. Mr. Natale, we had before us earlier, as you know, Mr. Charles Allen, who was also under oath, testify as following, that from 1976 until February of 1979, Mr. Allen, in other words, worked for Ralph Natale as a bodyguard, driver, strong arm, and anything else he wanted me to do. Now, you have testified he did work with the union. During that time, did he serve in these capacities for you? Answer, none whatsoever. Question, in no way whatsoever? In no way whatsoever. I can take care of my own body. And then a question came up on whether or not Mr. Scarfo came to see him as a customer. And Ralph had a restaurant. They also asked him about the restaurant, and he said he came by occasionally. And then there was a question. There was no dispute between you and Scarfo as to who would control the Hotel Workers Union in Atlantic City and who would control or provide the laundry, glasswork, meats, etc. And he said none whatsoever. All right, now the rubber started to hit the proverbial road because I was starting to get this sense, the way the questions were going, they were going to start questioning him about areas that they had him on tape with Charlie Allen. And we didn't have any tapes in front of us. He didn't have a chance to review any tapes. And a perjury trap is where, which I said before, they ask you a question they already know the answer to, or they have you on tape, and then it differs from what you may have said on tape. Mr. Zeitz, well, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the subcommittee has in its possession various transcripts of tape-recorded conversations that took place between Mr. Allen and other people, including but not limited to Mr. Natale. If Mr. Natale is going to be questioned in areas that relate directly to a tape-recorded conversation that occurred between himself and Mr. Allen, I request that as a matter of due process and fundamental fairness, that we be supplied with copies of the transcripts that relate to any questioning that may take place with regard to tape-recorded conversations. And then I mentioned the procedural rules, because I had a procedural rules of that committee that I had read and how that committee was supposed to operate. So the next thing that happens is they have an off-the-record discussion. Here's how that worked in this hearing. There's a bunch of lawyers, young lawyers, who were working for the senators. And next thing you know, I think each senator had like at least one, maybe two. So now all these guys, it was like a football huddle. They're all huddled up above where we are, because they're in a little higher in the room. And there's an off-the-record discussion between all these people. And then Senator Rudman says the following. Counsel, as I understand the order of the court, your client's been advised to testify in order to testify against immunity. If counsel would object to answering the question, I said, my response, Senator, would be as follows. The order is very clear. The order in case he has use immunity. However, in all situations involving use immunity, I'm sure the subcommittee is aware Mr. Natale could be prosecuted for perjury or giving a false statement or failing to comply with the order of the court. He's been incarcerated for over 40 months and basically let him know that we weren't budging. This is where this thing is headed. And I fully expect at some point in time, that's when there's a lot more heavy-handed stuff is going to take place. And they didn't disappoint me. Then Ross says, let me ask you again. On or about October 2nd, 1978, did you ask Mr. Allen to get a .22 automatic with a silencer? Subsequently, he said you needed 5 guns, and you told him, according to Mr. Allen, that they were for people downtown, which I meant lean on his people. Do you have any recollection of that conversation? Now, where do you think that came from? All of a sudden, the hearing is supposed to be the infiltration of the mob into the union, now deals with guns. So then I said, Chairman, on advice of counsel, I discussed this matter with my client. And he says the following: on advice from my counsel, I can't answer that question. And Ross says, on what grounds? I said, Mr. Chairman, I discussed this matter with my client. I've advised him, as his desire at this point, not to respond to that question on the basis that that question, in his opinion, and I can't disagree with him, goes beyond the scope of what we understand this hearing to be about. And consequently, he's not going to answer that question. Senator Ross says, I would just advise Mr. Natale and his counsel that the chair overruled such objection. I would ask once more the witness whether he will answer or not answer the question. Mr. Natale, I will not answer at this time. Okay, then there's another off-the-record discussion, another huddle up there. And then Senator Ross says, the chair would point out time is clicking by, would request your answer to the question. And then I say, you have to understand, Mr. Natale is about 2.5 hours away from my office. In order to meet with him, I have to go to the prison. This is my very first meeting with my client since being advised that he would be here pursuant to this recent grant of immunity. And then Ross says the following, Senator Roth, do you understand that you have been instructed to answer this question? He goes, yes, I do understand, Senator. And do you understand that in view of your refusal to answer in response to the subcommittee's grant of immunity, I believe that the record would support a finding of either civil or criminal contempt on your part. Such a finding could subject you to an additional incarceration beyond that which confronts you as a result of your prior federal convictions. I must advise you that such action on your part will not be taken lightly by a subcommittee of the U.S. Senate. Ralph's answer: I don't take it lightly either, Senator. I think this went beyond the scope of this investigation, to answer Senator Rudman. In regards to Charlie Allen, if I may just take a moment, he's not a complete liar. He tells 20% truth and 80% lies. I've got 27 years already. They're trying to give me even more time on the same case. I didn't come here to waste your time. It's nothing like that. I think it's a trap for me, and I wanted to answer the best I could. Right now, that's beyond my scope. All right, now they move on. They ask the next question. Let me ask you this question. Did you meet with Bruno? That refers to Angelo Bruno. Yes, I did. He's my friend. How often would you meet? Maybe twice a week. Did you meet on a weekly basis? Yes. Did he give you orders on union matters during these luncheons? Answer: never. Do you know Mr. Scarfo? Answer: yes, I do. I believe you testified to that. Do you know his occupation? I think Nicky was a bartender at one time. All right, now Senator Rudman jumps into the fray. I think he was a former attorney general from his state. So he was a lawyer, he was a prosecutor. He was somebody who, was pretty savvy about things. He said, tell us a little bit, if you know, about the leading organized crime figures that are in and around the area that you grew up in and the area that you operate business in, if you know. Answer: I don't know who the organized crime figures are. Well, who are some of the crime figures? Was Angelo Bruno a crime figure to your recollection? Answer: he was a fine man. And Nicky Scarfo? Nicky's a fine little guy. Question: What you're telling us is the various evidence that you heard in the course of your own trial and has been testified to by these people that all these wiretaps and informants are all lying? I do say that, Senator. You asked me what I knew. Me, I read the papers. 20 people, organized crime figures. I'm just saying what I know. And you ran a restaurant down there? Yes. And it says, and you ran this restaurant in all those years, and you want this subcommittee to believe you didn't hear anything about the fact that people like Nikki and Angelo were involved in organized crime and other criminal activities? Answer, only what I read in the great free press. Which you didn't believe? Of course not. I don't think you believe everything you read in the papers either. And then Rudman jumps in and says he doesn't see any really good purpose for any further questioning. He says that we don't have a meeting of the minds. And then they tell us that the hearings have been continued. Now, in Ralph's book, he gave a summary of what happened in that hearing. This is maybe a little tiny bit more expansive, to say the least. So it ends up that here's what happens. Because I not only have this to deal with, but I have his federal criminal case in federal court in Camden before a judge by the name of Judge Brotman, who was a highly respected judge who I had a lot of cases with, and I knew him very well. He was a good judge and a fair judge. So what happened is this. There was a co-defendant in the case, and the co-defendant was represented by a lawyer I knew named Jeffrey Miller. And Jeff Miller represented the co-defendant. I recall his name was Frank, I think it was Frank Vidino. And there was an assistant prosecutor for the government named Bob LaRusso, or LaRussa. So here's what happens. The case is listed for a hearing in front of Judge Brotman. And now I've got another TAMP story for you all. So who's there on behalf of the government? Bob LaRussa, who's the U.S. attorney, Jeff Miller, his client, me, and then I don't recall if they brought Ralph in. They probably would have had to do that. I'm almost positive they did. They had to bring him in, but he was doing time. So he comes, he's in custody. And we're out in the hallway, and we're about to go in to the judge's chambers to discuss with him the status of the case. And there was an offer, and the offer, it was 3 years as I recall, that they wanted consecutive to the 27 if Ralph would plead guilty. And what he was facing, I think the counts were like 5-year counts. Now, the reason why that was significant, those 3 years, is back at that time, the way that parole rules were constructed is if you had a sentence of 30 years or more, you had to do a minimum of 10 before you could even consider applying to go before the board, the parole board. And that can always take an extended period of time. And Ralph was under the same situation as Frank with CIM, Central Inmate Monitoring, which meant that every single thing that happened on his case, Washington, D.C. would know or have to approve. So the big battle on the case, that case, was I didn't have a problem with Ralph pleading guilty as long as the sentence was concurrent, which meant no more time. So in other words, his 27 stays 27. He'll plead. He'll get rid of the case. We're not going to put the government to the expense of a trial. So here's what happens. We're out in the hallway. We're ready to go in. And Bob LaRussa says to me and to Jeff, he said, I got a problem. I said, well, what kind of problem do you have? He says, Agent Tam. I said, what kind of problem do you have with Agent Tam? He's your agent. He said, he doesn't want us to go in and meet with the judge in his chambers without him being there. I said, you got to be kidding me. I said, I've never heard that before. I've never heard a U.S. assistant say that the FBI agent, who's the case agent, wants to come in and be in the judge's chambers. I said, who doesn't he trust? I said, I know he doesn't trust me. I'm sure he doesn't trust Jeff, but he doesn't even trust you. He said he wants to be in the judge's chambers. He said, I need to know what your opinion is. I said, my opinion is the following. I think we ought to go, just tell the judge what's going on Let the judge decide what he wants to do. It's his chambers. He's the judge, just like it's his courtroom. As far as I'm concerned, I have no objection. If the judge is willing to let him in to his chambers, which is like highly, highly unusual, it's up to the judge. Let him call it. So here's how it plays out. We go in. He tells Judge Brotman what the problem is and that he's waiting out in the hallway and he wants to be here if we're going to have a meeting. And then he says to me, he says, well, what's your position, Glenn? And I said, I don't care, Judge. It's your chambers. You decide whatever you want to do. He says to Jeff, how about you? He said, I'm with Glenn. It's your chambers. You decide what you want to do. So you know what he says? He says, let him come in. Okay, so he marches in. So now I got Quinn John Tam in the judge's chambers. And he walks in, and the way I remember his chambers is obviously the judge is sitting behind his desk, and he is like that way. There's a chair here, a sofa, and there were at least one or more of these nice leather chairs. So the minute he walks in, I didn't sit down. The judge, I don't know if the judge sat down or not. I know we didn't yet. He walks in, the very first thing I said to him, I said, John, I said, why don't you tell us what seat you want? I said, this way you can pick. And he looked at me, when someone looks at somebody like two dogs looking at each other or something, and he just sits down. I'm pretty sure he sat on the sofa. So now he's there. We're talking to the judge, and we're having a discussion about what we're going to do with the case. So finally, we work out the following understanding, that Ralph will admit and plead guilty to a count, and that I'm going to argue before the judge for a concurrent sentence, that it not run after, it doesn't run consecutive, it runs with, therefore no more time. The government's going to ask for 3 years over and above the 27. So the outcome of the case turns out in the following way. And that is that the judge, after he hears all the evidence, and there's a pre-sentence report, reviews all that, go back for sentencing, and John's there. We make our arguments, and the judge imposes an order of 3 consecutive. So I leave, and I didn't get what I wanted. I got a 30-year consecutive sentence, which was what I didn't want. And I remember leaving, and I just thought to myself, this is really unfair. And that is that, he admitted his guilt. He made statements at sentencing that I thought were good, sounded believable, at least to me. And I was just thinking to myself, this really shouldn't have to happen. He's already doing 27 years at this point. Do you really need this in order to do what? To get him to cooperate, to get him to do something? Because he knew that, and Ralph was like my other clients, he knew that I would not be a party to somebody becoming an informant. I wouldn't become a party to Ralph or anybody. If someone was going to do that, I always told him, go get another lawyer. There's plenty of lawyers out there that you can find that will do that, not me. So I was pissed. I was pissed at Tam. I wasn't pissed at the judge. I was just pissed at the whole situation. Well, there was more to come, because here's what happened. 2 things. The Senate sent another subpoena out, and there was a second hearing before the same Senate subcommittee. And this time, it was different than the first, because this time, the only witness was Ralph Natale. And another thing that happened was they closed the room. It was this gigantic room. Remember, it was a big door. I mean, when I say big, like major. And it was like being in a prison when you hear the sound, the clang of a big door. Because here's what happened. I think I had some family members. They came up. They told everybody, you are not allowed in. The only people who are allowed in, it's a closed door session of a congressional subcommittee. And the only people who can be in there are them, Mr. Natale, and me. So we spent, I forget how many hours in there. And they grilled him with this, and they grilled him with that, and all this other stuff. They still weren't happy, obviously. And what I did as a lawyer, what I viewed this as, was an attempt in a closed-door hearing to try to send a message out that maybe he was cooperating. In other words, the public, the press, nobody else was allowed in that room. And here a guy is doing time, heavy-duty time in a maximum security prison, and all of a sudden now he's in front of a closed-door hearing of the Senate, and nobody's allowed in there but him and his lawyer. So when I came out, and don't forget, he has to go back to prison. The very first thing I did, and it's like a media frenzy, and there are all kinds of articles that were reported and came out with regard to this hearing and what happened, and I'm going to get to some of them and what was said. Very first thing I had to do is make sure that they understood and knew that he was not an informant. He was not cooperating with the government for a multitude of reasons. Number one, it was the truth. Number two, for his own protection when he went back to a maximum security prison. That he was maintaining what he believed to be, at least at that point, knowledge or lack of knowledge that he felt about what he was saying. And, I don't know or know like whether something is absolute truth or not truth. I know you hear things. You encourage clients to do the right thing. You can't be a party to, and I've never been a party of subornation of perjury or having somebody lie or anything like that. But the problem is, with a lot of this stuff, it goes back years in time. Transcripts, if you have a transcript, you've already heard me read from some transcripts. If you have a transcript, you can use something to refresh your memory. Say, yeah, I said this, but I meant that, or yes, I did this, or it's a hell of a lot easier. So anyway, so he ended up going back to prison. And then the next thing happened procedurally is this. There was a rule in those days, Rule 35. You could file a motion within a certain time period for a reduction or modification of a sentence. And I figured, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go back in front of that judge again. And I'm going to come up with any argument I can that I think I can make to get that 3 years reduced back to 27. And we had a hearing. And the government took the same position. And I don't recall whether John Tamp showed up or didn't show up. Because at this point, I don't know one way or the other. All I know is the following. That the judge actually reconsidered what he did and made those 3 years concurrent. So Ralph was back to a 27-year sentence. But what happened then is when the time came later for Ralph to come up for parole, Senator Roth, on behalf of that committee, did everything in the committee's power to block him getting parole at what would have been the normal time period. And I don't know off the top of my head how many years Ralph did, but I do know the following. I know that he ended up doing more than the 1/3 of 27. I knew he did more than 9 years. So in one way or the other, they figured out a way for him to be further punished for whatever you want to view how they felt he was, whether he was contemptuous or of the hearing or however you want to characterize it. So eventually, Ralph came out of prison. When he came out of prison, I remember accidentally bumping into him where there was a restaurant. And I was with another client, and he came over, and I saw him. And he said, Glenn, it's Ralph. And when to know how I was doing, I said, I'm doing okay. And I asked him how he was doing, and that was all right, And then there were newspaper articles that came out as a result of Ralph's testifying and also Alan's testimony. Now, Nicky Scarfo himself pled nothing but the fifth. So he pled the fifth. And Bobby had cue cards, which is not unusual. So Nicky could just read off the cue cards that he was asserting his Fifth Amendment right to self-incrimination and the other rights that Bob had prepared for him. So basically, he did what he had the right to do. He served the Fifth, and then he raised other constitutional defenses. So therefore, he didn't have to testify because there was no grant of immunity. And then there was different articles that came out as a result of this hearing. And I'm going to go over one or two of them. This is from the New York Times. When the New Jersey legislature debated and adopted the state's Casino Control Act 5 years ago, particular emphasis was placed on preventing organized crime from infiltrating the new casino industry in Atlantic City. Said the local represents 12,000 bartenders, bellmen, waiters, waitresses, maids, and other employees. Most work in the casino hotels. Authorities have expressed concern that organized crime may use the union to extract payments from the casinos in return for labor peace. And then they mentioned Salerno. Joseph Salerno, a former associate of Nicodemo Scarfo, testified Thursday behind a screen, shielding him from the hearing room audience, and said, organized crime hoped to own Atlantic City someday. Mr. Salerno, a former brigantine plumber, now has a new undisclosed identity in the Federal Witness Protection Program. He was guarded by 15 federal marshals and state policemen during his testimony. 15 federal marshals and state policemen, and we're in the federal building, the Richard Russell building. And he's behind the screen. Now, not only were they behind a screen, they disguised their voices.
Now, you testified about a conversation with Nick Scarfo where he distinguished between junkies, racketeers, and gangsters. What did he tell you the difference was, and where did he fit in?
Well, here's what he told me. He said he got me in a bar one day that he wanted to talk to me, and he told me there's junkies, racketeers, and there's gangsters. We don't bother with junkies because they're in the dope. Racketeers, he says, they got to come to us to do things for them, meaning killing, murder. And he says, us, he says also racketeers pay cops off, we don't. And he says, us, we do everything ourselves. We're the ones. We're the real mafia, us.
And then Special Agent James Moore. Now, remember I talked about James Moore when I was talking about Frank Sheeran. He testified that Mr. Scarfo was the boss of the Angelo Bruno organized crime family in Philadelphia and Atlantic City. That was Salerno. All right, then there's an article in the New York Times. Mob killer says Hoffa told him to slay successor. This is the following. A self-described mob murderer said today that James Hoffa, former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, ordered him 7 years ago to kill Mr. Hoffa's successor, Frank E. Fitzsimmons. Testifying under oath before a Senate subcommittee, Charles Allen, who has been a participant in the federal program for protected witnesses since 1979, said Mr. Hoffa told him that he intended to have 4 persons involved in organized crime killed in an attempt to regain control of the union. Mr. Allen testified the scheme became known to members of the underworld and led to Mr. Hoffa's disappearance. Mr. Allen, who is 50 years old, said that after Mr. Hoffa disappeared on July 30, 1975, Tony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamster leader who was one of the reputed organized crimes figures marked for death, told him Jimmy was killed, grounded up in little pieces, and shipped to Florida and dumped in a swamp. Mr. Allen seemed to imply, but did not say directly, that Mr. Provenzano had arranged for Mr. Hoffa's murder. Mr. Provenzano is now serving a 20-year sentence for labor racketeering. Mr. Allen made his disclosures at a hearing of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations into Reports of Organized Crime Influence in some of the hotels. So that was the song that Charlie Allen was singing at that point in time. And then said the following. Mr. Allen, flanked by armed federal marshals and testifying from behind a beaded glass obscured the pictures that he and Hoffa had been inmates of federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania.
So Hoffa was going to kill both Tony Pro and Frank Fitzsimmons?
And there was supposed to be 3 other fellas, too.
3 other people were going to get killed, too? Was that in an effort to take back over the Teamsters?
That was to put everybody in line in the Teamsters.
Did Hoffa tell you this personally?
I found that out later. I didn't even know about Tony Pro going to be killed.
But, I mean, did he tell you the reason you were killing Fitzsimmons?
Oh, sure.
What was the reason?
Because he was going to take over again.
And it raises a public policy issue, I think. And that is, which I thought a lot about back then and even now. When you put people in these programs, it's understandable. They're making, to some extent, you can understand that what they're trying to do is encourage people to provide information about other people. But then you have to say at what price? In terms of what are you getting? Now, there's a term in the law that I want to tell everybody about. And if you serve on a jury sometime, you should hear it. It's called falsus in unis, falsus in omnibus. It's Latin. It means false in one, false in all. Falsus in unis, falsus in omnibus. False in one, false in all. And a judge, if it's appropriate in a given case, can say to a jury, if you find that a witness has testified about something that's material, not something like, he's missed a day or this or that or something minor, but something material, and you believe that that witness lied, you have the right as a juror to disregard the entire testimony of that witness. Or you could believe some of it or part of it. It's your province as a juror when you assess the credibility and believability of a witness. But in some of these cases, especially with a guy like Charlie Allen, you got to think about this. Here's a guy that admitted that, like hundreds of times, he lied under oath. Lied under oath. And what I recall, and there's a case that I had years ago involving Jay Smith. It's a death penalty case. What happened in that case, which was totally bizarre, in those days, Pennsylvania had a rule that if you had been convicted of perjury, you were disqualified as a witness. So in other words, if you were found guilty of perjury, you could not be a competent witness in any case because basically you were found to be a liar. And what happened with him, wait to hear this one, it still makes my blood boil in some ways. In his case, I actually had a letter prepared that if somebody tried to talk to him, he had a letter on my stationery that said, my client has been advised by his lawyer not to discuss his case with anyone for any reason. And you are to give, and he was to give this to anybody to look at, right? Here's what happens. There's a guy that's in prison. Wait to hear this one. Who's an ex-cop. I think his name was Raymond Martre. And he's in prison. He's in prison on a perjury and some burglary charges or something. And Jay Smith was what you call a jailhouse lawyer. He was pretty well educated. He was writing briefs to help other inmates. So Martre goes to see Jay Smith, and he asks him to write a brief for him to try to help him get his convictions overturned. So guess what happens? Wait to hear this one. Turns out that Jay Smith works on his appeal and works on writing a brief to help him on his appeal to the Superior Court, which is above the Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania, in state court. And at that time, if you were found guilty and had a conviction for perjury, you were incompetent. Well, guess what? During that time period, he was tape recording for the government, for the DA's office, Jay Smith. So while Jay is doing his brief and trying to help him, he's tape recording Jay. And guess what happens on appeal? You're going to love this. The Superior Court, there's a decision that's rendered. They affirm, like it was like burglary convictions, and they overturn the perjury conviction. And they take an incompetent witness and make that witness competent. That's how that plays out. And then that surfaces later. And I end up representing Jay Smith at a preliminary hearing in Harrisburg that went on for a few days. And he becomes one of the star witnesses against him. Now, how does that apply to Ralph Natale? Well, here's what happens with Ralph. Ralph, they had I don't know if you call it a code or something that everybody was supposed to consider and honor, and that is never trust an ex-cop. So here's what happens to Ralph. Ralph is now out. And there's a guy who was collecting money for the mob. So basically, if you needed something, done to try to encourage somebody to pay what they owed, he did those kinds of things. And his name was Ron Previty. So what happened is they have him in a case, and he eventually becomes close to Ralph and others, and close enough that here's what takes place. Ron Previty begins to record Ralph Natale. And then I think you know where this is heading. And then eventually, Ralph Natale gets indicted, and he's going to be charged in a whole new set of cases. And he then decides what turns out to be, at least in my mind, because during the entire time period that I represented Ralph, we fought the government as best we could. Bobby had done that on 2 trials. I did it both in front of the Senate with him, and both with regard to the case that I had in front of Judge Brotman. Ralph knew, like all my clients, that I would never represent somebody who was an informant like this. Because my attitude was, well, what do you need a lawyer who can try cases and, who wants to fight cases and stuff? You can go to a lot of lawyers. So he didn't come to me. He went to somebody else. And then the day came, and I opened up the paper, and this is what I saw. On the front page of the Philadelphia Daily News, I saw a picture of Ralph, and underneath what you see, King Rat. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that at any point in time he would do what he did. And he claimed he had his reasons. And let's put it this way, lawyers don't do the time. The clients do. They do the time. So you can't, as a lawyer, take the position, well, I would have done this or I would have done that, unless you've actually had to do time yourself, which I've never wanted to do, quite frankly. And normally you don't want something like that in your life. So here's what happens. When I read it, I couldn't believe it. I said to myself, it's impossible. After being a stand-up guy and doing time in a level 5 in Lewisburg and doing things, you could say the old-fashioned way or whatever, back in the day. And then after this happened and it circulated throughout the city, it didn't take too long to circulate because stuff like this travels like wildfire. And I remember when that happened, I remember saying to myself, that's one of the things they always talked about, never trust an ex-cop. Well, he trusted that guy enough that he talked to him. And then he got himself in the proverbial jackpot. So here's what then they wrote. And, the media is a little fickle, as they say. This was an article, 2 things in particular I remember reading. One was written by a friend of mine, who actually I've talked about with regard to this podcast. And I told him, some things that I'd be interested in him coming in and sharing with my audience. His name's George Anastasia. George wrote for the Inquirer. George covered cases that I had for years. And George is still around. And he's a great guy and a good writer. And he tries to get all the different parts of a story. And everybody knows him because of some of the things he's done, the work that he's done over the years. So here's what came out. Now, remember, I played no role in the book that Ralph wrote. I'm not quoting there. I played no role in the book that Frank Sheeran wrote with Charlie Brandt. Nobody asked me to participate in that, and that's fine with me. So I played no role in these books at all. So here's what they wrote. It was written by George. This was April 12th, 2017. Mobster Ralph Natale's life story. Philly underworld calls BS on fake news. Some of the guys in South Philly are calling it fake news. Others are using a more graphic description. Bullshit. Says the book and the word of the interview have already created a buzz in Philadelphia underworld and law enforcement circles. Players from both sides are said to be less than pleased and more than a little taken aback by the version of events presented by the one-time Don turned star government witness. These are George's words. Ralph spins a good story and he clearly enjoys being center stage. But while he likes to portray himself as Don Corleone, in reality, he was more like Uncle Junior. I don't know if any of you watched The Sopranos. I got caught watching The Sopranos, I have to admit. And I ended up watching every episode, no matter, and it was so difficult because I kept saying to myself, why are you continuing to watch this? I couldn't help myself. And I think I did it because I wanted to wait and see how it all was going to end. And then the ending was so disappointing. You know, they're all sitting in that booth, and then you don't know what the hell happened. You're left to your imagination in some way. So I thought to myself, I wasted all those hours, watching it. Not only the fact that here I am living through some of this stuff, right? So, but I couldn't help it. So I knew who Uncle Junior was. So then he wrote, he's stashed away in the witness protection program. And was Ralph a tough guy in his early years? Probably. Was he a murderer? Without question. And then he pretty much writes this story. So that's how it was viewed. And then there was another person who wrote something, who did an interview with Ralph. And it was someone named Paul Davis. So he did an article also. And, he mentions what I've already told you about Ron Previty. And he asked Ralph questions about it. And there's pictures and all that. But the larger issue, I think, from a society standpoint, is where I'm heading. And where I'm heading right now. Because the thing that you have to understand is that while I was representing Frank, I was representing Ralph. And that anything that I had an agreement with both, if something popped up in either of their cases, that certainly, because I was representing each of them, I'd make sure that if it could help both, I'd be in a position to help one or the other. They both knew that. So now I want to get to what happened with Charlie Allen. Not in Louisiana, but in Virginia. This is my file here on what happened Charlie Allen, Virginia cases. And now you're going to hear, I'm not going to give you all the gory details. I'm going to tell you the gist of what occurred and what my issue is, which I think is important for all of us to talk about and think about in terms of people who go into the federal witness protection program. And then what do you end up getting? You end up getting a born-again Christian who now is going to change and turn over a new leaf, or you're going to get a dangerous person that infiltrates people in a nice neighborhood. In sexual cases, we have Megan's Law now. And one of my closest friends who I had a case with when he was in the Attorney General's office in Jersey, I had a case that I'll tell you about later. There was a big fraud case, insurance fraud case. It's just fascinating. And he later left the Attorney General's office and he went to work as a private attorney. And his specialty was Megan's Law, handling Megan's Law type issues, which, as you know, came out, which requires reporting of sexual offenders. And depending on the degree of someone being a habitual and repetitive sexual offender, determines the danger that they're going to reoffend. And if they're put in a neighborhood with people, you got to notify people within a certain distance that somebody's there. So here's what happens. And I'm going to look at the report that I have. And the report is from my investigator, Russell Collins again, Kolins. And it's Charles Allen. And it has also known as, it has his names. It's August 27, 1993. And here's what he says in his report. He sends a report that there were offenses, crimes charged against Allen, fraud, theft, possession of a shotgun, and other probation violations, all of which, according to him, were discounted in some fashion. And then he talks about the case that involved a family member. And this was down, as I mentioned before, in Virginia. It wasn't in Louisiana. And he talks about a trial, talked to the prosecutor who prosecuted the case. Interestingly enough, Henry Handy, Henry, who you heard about, is a character witness in some fashion. I don't know how much he could talk to about his good character. I mean, you really got to think hard. And then the government apparently communicated two concerns. Wait to hear this one. And don't forget, this is a prosecutor down in Virginia trying to prosecute a serious crime. And here's what one of the first concerns were. First, that classified materials regarding the witness protection program not be used at trial. Second, in the event that Allen got convicted, he'd be turned over to the custody of the government to be placed in a federal institution under federal protection. Now, as it turns out, here's how it plays out. One of the things I thought was funny, Lindsay, who's the prosecutor, is quoted, my investigator has him saying, he found Allen to be a very clever, conniving, manipulative individual who would con many people in believing that he found God. Are you ready for this one? One of his offenses, I got a little X here, was almost like, I can't believe this. He was fired this past Easter when he was caught stealing chocolate Easter bunnies. And there was a manager from the store. Now, apparently, he had over 60 people show up at sentencing. 10 were permitted to testify. I don't know who they were, but maybe in some regard, there were people who believed in him, believed that he had turned over a new leaf. And then it mentions here, Handy mentioned a couple of times that he had to check with his Philadelphia contact, Agent Tam. So he ended up getting 90 years, 45 with no parole from Virginia. But then he went with the federal people to wherever he ended up with them in their custody. Here's a quote on all this. And as I mentioned before, this all came out well after the two trials of Lou Battone and Frank Sheeran. This all surfaced later. So the FBI can't be faulted for knowing this before those trials came into being. Here's a quote from Philly.com. After years of talking himself out of it, Mobster gets jailed. He was an informant and self-described hitman. His stepdaughter said he was also a rapist. Here's another article. This is from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. This is down in Virginia. Man formerly in witness protection program to be sentenced on sex charges tomorrow. Here's another one, Richmond Times-Dispatch. Now, the judge down there didn't buy it, obviously. So I hope that this in some way maybe stimulates a little bit of discussion and thought about this whole idea of paying people in cash, putting them in a program, and what has the government or the people, what do the people out there who pay their taxes and support this, what are they getting as a return, so to speak? And then also, what kind of damage can be done when you put somebody somewhere in a neighborhood and nobody knows really what that person is or may do. And with regard to Ralph, as I said, I was shocked to hear what happened. I played absolutely no role in that. He got another attorney and wrote the book and gave his reasons in the book when I read it for doing what he did. And if anybody would like to read it, they're more than welcome to do it. You'll have an opportunity to make a judgment for yourself about all these things. That's why I'm doing some of these things, because it's a difficult arena to not only be a lawyer in, but also to figure out how do you properly prosecute certain types of crimes without giving away the store, or without taking people who really don't deserve to be out in society, in somebody's neighborhood, where you don't know who you're really dealing with, who's in your neighborhood, and what can happen. So on that note, I want to tell you what I have planned next. In the next episode of Philly Trial Lawyer Stories, I'm going to move on. And the reason why I'm going to move on is because I want to start talking about some contemporary things that are going on right now. So there's a lot of cases in between that I'm going to get to at some point. I think that you're going to find very interesting. Some of them are death penalty cases. One in particular involves the use of sodium amytal on a client of mine to refresh his recollection, enable him to mount an insanity and diminished capacity defense. Another one is a client who we'll get to, who had his partner in a sex club murdered, kneecapped, tied a ligature, the body put in a 55-gallon drum, and then he's going to take it out and dump it in the ocean. And that's a case I had to try with the drum in the courtroom. And then I've got the master of all criminal fraudsters who had phony insurance companies and wrote financial bonds and guarantees for actually government bodies and people who made a lot of money. And one of the most crazy individuals I've ever met. He could have either been, if he was a legitimate businessman, he would have been a multimillionaire, but he couldn't do something like that. Then I have an unsolved case I want to talk about that haunts me to this day, which is a cold case. And I'm hoping that by saying and doing certain things, maybe we can urge this case to be reopened. It's been reopened and they're looking at it, but you never know if there's more thinking that can come about that may actually help me with regard to that case. And there's a whole host of others. So stay tuned, and I hope you give me feedback. I hope you let me know how you feel about some of what I've said or some of the issues, because I would welcome that. Thank you for listening to Philly Trial Lawyer Stories. If you want to learn more about me or my cases, go to glennzeitz.com, GLENNZEITZ.com. To contact me, email glenn@gazproductions.com. If you want to support Philly Trial Lawyer Stories, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast. And make sure you tell your friends and family too. Philly Trial Lawyer Stories is hosted by Glenn Zeitz and produced by Studio D Podcast Production.